Sir Humphrey's face took on the colour of poorly boiled beetroot, which Whimsy found rather encouraging. A man sufficiently irritated to abandon his pretense of social pleasantry was invariably a man on the verge of becoming truthful. "The pantry, then," the baronet said, with the air of a man committing himself to a course of action he had considered and rejected in roughly equal measure. "Though I should warn you that the local superintendent is already inclined to view any outside interference as an affront to his professional competence. Inspector Fulton is not a man who takes kindly to what he terms amateur meddling, and I fear your reputation has preceded you rather more enthusiastically than might be strictly comfortable." Whimsy followed Sir Humphrey through a succession of corridors decorated in that particular shade of institutional green that seemed to appeal to the owners of country houses everywhere, as though they had collectively decided that domestic comfort was rather less important than reminding one of the waiting rooms in provincial railway stations. The passages were lined with the accumulated detritus of a century, sporting prints, photographs of individuals who had likely been substantially more interesting at the moment of their demise than they appeared in portraiture, and a rather extraordinary stuffed badger whose expression suggested it had died under circumstances of considerable philosophical disappointment. It was during this promenade that Whimsy observed something rather more pertinent than the aesthetic shortcomings of the corridor. The servants were watching them. Not obviously, of course. These were English servants, trained in the art of invisibility, but they were watching nonetheless, with that particular fixity of attention that suggested news of a death in the household had already circulated below stairs with the efficiency of a telegraph service. The pantry itself was a room of modest dimensions, organized with the sort of systematic precision that spoke of a man who had taken his domestic arrangements as seriously as a conductor takes his orchestra. The walls were lined with cupboards, each painted a serviceable cream, and the central table bore the remnants of silver polish and a cloth that had been neatly folded and placed to one side, the very image of interrupted industry. But it was not the domestic tidiness that arrested Whimsy's attention. Rather, it was the body. Edgar Marsh lay on the floor beside his work table in a position of remarkable composure, one arm extended as though reaching for something just beyond his grasp, his face bearing that peculiar expression of profound surprise that death sometimes confers upon the living. His collar was immaculately pressed, Whimsy noted, white linen of excellent quality, starched to the point of rigidity, and not a thread of his waistcoat was out of place. Even in death, the man maintained his standards. "How long has he been here?" Whimsy inquired without moving closer. Sir Humphrey consulted a pocket watch with the air of a man performing an action that had already been performed numerous times by numerous other individuals. He was discovered at 8:30 this morning by one of the housemaids. The doctor, a rather competent fellow named Ashford, though perhaps not possessed of the most adventurous imagination, examined him shortly after 10 and pronounced it a cardiac event. The body hasn't been moved, save to establish that he was already cold and quite thoroughly deceased. Whimsy circled the room with his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze moving systematically from the cupboards to the table, from the table to the body, and from the body to a small window set high in the wall, which appeared to open onto the garden. "Curious," he remarked. "The man reaches, as you observe, for something beyond his grasp, yet the table before him is empty save for his polishing cloth. One might presume that whatever he was reaching for was removed subsequent to his death, or one might presume that he was reaching for something that was never there at all. The latter possibility strikes me as rather more interesting, though I cannot pretend to have formulated an opinion of any real substance without considerably more information." He paused beside the cupboards and ran his fingers along the edge of one, examining them with the concentration of a man inspecting a manuscript for variants in handwriting. "These have been opened recently. You can see where the dust has been disturbed, though rather carefully. Someone was being rather thorough in their examination, and rather anxious not to advertise the fact. Tell me, Sir Humphrey, had Edgar Marsh received any visitors in the days preceding his death? Unusual callers, I mean, or perhaps familiar individuals behaving with unusual manner?" Sir Humphrey appeared to wrestle with this question as though it were written in a language he only half understood. "There was a visitor on Monday evening," he said slowly. "A woman, though I did not see her myself. One of the servants mentioned it. She came to the kitchen entrance asking for Edgar specifically. Mrs. Pettigrew, the cook, said she was rather agitated and that Edgar had received her in his pantry and asked that they not be disturbed. The visitor left perhaps 20 minutes later, and no one seems to have seen her depart, which is to say that E left without announcing her departure or presenting herself to anyone in particular." Whimsy turned away from the cupboards with an expression of heightened interest, though whether this interest was genuinely provoked or carefully manufactured for Sir Humphrey's benefit was a question that remained, as it so often did, entirely open to interpretation. A woman, then, agitated and unknown, and no one has troubled to communicate this rather salient detail to the superintendent. Sir Humphrey's silence was answer enough. Whimsy smiled, the sort of smile that suggested he had just been presented with a puzzle box and had already ascertained the location of the hidden mechanism. "How very interesting. I begin to suspect, Sir Humphrey, that your reticence about this entire affair is not the result of a desire for privacy, so much as a rather more specific concern about what precisely the superintendent might discover were he to begin asking the correct questions. But we shall address that matter later. For now, I should very much like to speak with the cook." Mrs. Pettigrew occupied the kitchen with the authority of a general commanding a well-fortified position, and it was immediately apparent to Whimsy that she was a woman who had never suffered from any particular doubt regarding her place in the domestic hierarchy. She was perhaps 50 years of age, with the sort of face that suggested a lifetime of strong opinions about the proper temperature for custard and the moral failings of those who employed inferior cuts of meat. When Sir Humphrey introduced Whimsy, she regarded him with the cautious suspicion one might reserve for a man attempting to sell one a gold brick at a railway station. "I'm sure I don't know nothing about any visitor," she announced, before Whimsy had so much as opened his mouth to inquire. "And if Sir Humphrey has been suggesting otherwise, well, I can only say that a cook's business is in the kitchen, not in the comings and goings of the pantry, which is Mr. Marsh's domain entirely." This speech was delivered with such conviction that Whimsy found himself almost admiring the woman's commitment to the art of lying whilst maintaining the appearance of absolute honesty. Almost, but not quite. "How very true," he said pleasantly, settling himself upon a stool with the air of a man preparing for an extended conversation. "Though I confess I have always found that a cook possessed of any real sophistication maintains a rather more comprehensive awareness of household affairs than a mere consideration of culinary matters might suggest. One could hardly maintain adequate provisions without understanding the social dynamics of one's establishment. Tell me, Mrs. Pettigrew, in your years of service here, and I perceive it has been considerably more than a decade, given the confident manner in which you navigate this kitchen, have you observed any particular changes in Mr. Marsh's demeanor? Anxiety, perhaps, or a certain distraction?" Mrs. Pettigrew's jaw tightened slightly, which suggested that Whimsy's approach had struck rather closer to the mark than she had anticipated. "Mr. Marsh was always a quiet gentleman," she said, carefully selecting each word as though handling articles of considerable fragility. "Kept himself to himself, very proper, very correct. There was nothing unusual about him that I could discern." Whimsy stood and moved toward the kitchen window, where the afternoon light was beginning to acquire that quality of melancholy that seems endemic to English kitchens in autumn. "And yet," he continued, with an air of reflecting upon matters of no particular significance, "the woman who called on Monday evening was agitated, according to your own recollection. One does not generally become agitated in the press. Hence of a man one describes as merely quiet, unless that man is in possession of some particular power over one's emotions, affection perhaps, or conversely, a capacity to inspire fear. Which do you imagine it was?" He turned back to face the cook, and Mrs. Pettigrew had the distinct expression of someone who had just realized that the harmless observation they had made was in fact a rather carefully constructed trap. "I couldn't say, sir," she replied, her voice taking on a defensive quality it had not previously possessed. "It wasn't my place to inquire into Mr. Marsh's personal arrangements." "Wasn't your place?" Whimsy repeated, with an inflection that managed to suggest both polite incredulity and the sort of detached amusement one derives from watching someone attempt to navigate a morass of their own creation. "My dear Mrs. Pettigrew, you are a woman of considerable intelligence and authority within this household. I find it rather difficult to believe that you would have permitted the development of any significant event within these walls without maintaining at least a general awareness of its particulars. No, I think the more plausible explanation is that you maintained a very clear understanding of the situation indeed, and that you have chosen, for reasons best known to yourself, to refrain from communicating that understanding to anyone in official capacity, which suggests, does it not, that you possess some loyalty to Mr. Marsh, or alternatively, some anxiety regarding what might transpire were certain facts to become public knowledge." Mrs. Pettigrew's face had taken on a shade of color that suggested she was contemplating several possible responses and finding each one substantially less palatable than the last. She turned to the sink with an air of busying herself with matters of pressing culinary importance, though Whimsy observed that she was doing nothing whatsoever with the dishes she appeared to be arranging. "There was a daughter," she said at last, so quietly that Whimsy had to shift his position slightly in order to hear her properly. "Mr. Marsh's daughter. She came from London, she did, on Monday evening. He hadn't seen her in, well, it must have been 20 years or more. They had some sort of disagreement years ago before I ever came to work here, but she came to see him, and they talked for a long while, and then she left. And I never thought, I mean to say, I couldn't have known." Her voice trailed away into a silence that was rather more eloquent than any speech could have been. Whimsy nodded slowly, as though this revelation merely confirmed what he had already deduced from the arrangement of the teacups, or the particular shade of discoloration on the kitchen tiles. "And did you happen to observe this daughter's demeanor when she departed?" he inquired, with the sort of casual interest one might display regarding the weather. "Was she relieved, perhaps, or distraught? Did she appear to have achieved a reconciliation with her father, or did the meeting leave matters between them considerably more complicated than before?" Mrs. Pettigrew's silence was itself an answer, and Whimsy found himself wondering precisely what combination of filial affection, financial desperation, or psychological manipulation had driven a woman to visit her estranged father, only to depart without so much as a farewell. "I see," he said, though he saw rather more than mere silence could articulate. "And does this daughter have a name, Mrs. Pettigrew, or shall I be forced to deduce it from the more challenging pursuit of examining railway records and hotel registers?" "Miss Catherine Marsh," Mrs. Pettigrew said, finally turning to face Whimsy with an expression that suggested she had just surrendered a position she had been defending with considerable determination. "She lives in London, in some sort of theatrical capacity, though Mr. Marsh never spoke of it directly. I gathered the information from fragments of conversation overheard through the years, the sort of thing one picks up when one has been in service long enough to understand that people reveal far more through what they do not say than through their direct utterances. She had written to him, I believe, though he kept her letters locked away in a box beneath his bed. I came upon them once when turning out his room, purely by accident, you understand, and I had the decency to replace them without reading their contents. This last protestation was delivered with such transparent insincerity that Whimsy found himself positively charmed by the woman's commitment to the fiction of her own moral probity. "How very discreet of you," he remarked, allowing just enough skepticism to color his tone that Mrs. Pettigrew would understand that her performance had not passed entirely unappreciated. "Though I suspect you gathered sufficient information to form at least a general impression of the nature of the correspondence. Letters of reconciliation, perhaps? Or alternatively, letters of demand, financial or otherwise?" Mrs. Pettigrew opened her mouth, closed it again, and then began wiping her hands on her apron with the concentration of a woman attempting to transfer her anxiety through the medium of linen. "The letters spoke of difficulties," she said at last. "Miss Catherine had fallen upon hard times, or so one gathered from the fragments from what I heard, I mean. Mr. Marsh had always supported her, sending money regularly, though he never spoke of it to anyone. He was that sort of man, you see, generous, but quiet about his generosity." ashamed of it perhaps, given that the circumstances of her birth were not entirely regular, if you key my meaning. Whimsy took her meaning precisely, and filed it away alongside the other accumulated details that were gradually beginning to form a pattern of rather more complexity than a simple cardiac event might explain. A man living respectably as a house steward for 15 years, all the while maintaining contact with an illegitimate daughter he had been forced to abandon. This was precisely the sort of domestic secret that could accumulate sufficient pressure to require some form of explosive release. And when Miss Catherine arrived on Monday evening, Whimsy continued, moving toward the kitchen table where he seated himself with an air of settling in for an extended conversation, did Mr. Marsh seem pleased to see her, or did he appear troubled? Mrs. Pettigrew hesitated, and in that hesitation lay the entire weight of her moral uncertainty regarding how much she was permitted to reveal without actively betraying the man she had served for so many years. "He seemed frightened," she said finally, the words emerging as though extracted by considerable force of will. "I saw him in the corridor before she arrived, and his hands were shaking. I asked if he was unwell, but he said it was merely the excitement of an unexpected visitor." "But it wasn't excitement, sir. It was fear." Whimsy rose and moved to the window again, his fingers drumming a silent rhythm against the glass. "Fear suggests that Miss Catherine's visit was not entirely welcome, or, alternatively, that her presence had activated some dormant anxiety regarding past events. Tell me, Mrs. Pettigrew, in the 15 years you have served in this household, did Mr. Marsh ever speak of his daughter's mother? Of what circumstances had necessitated their separation?" The cook's face took on an expression of profound discomfort, as though she were being asked to trespass upon territory that propriety had explicitly forbidden her to explore. "Only once," she said quietly. "Years ago, when he'd had rather more to drink than was his custom. He said that some mistakes could not be corrected, only endured. He said that he had failed a woman he cared for deeply, and that the cost of that failure would haunt him until his dying day. He seemed to think that Miss Catherine would despise him for his weakness, though from what I could gather, she never did. She only wanted—" Mrs. Pettigrew's voice broke slightly. "She only wanted him to acknowledge her, to admit that she was real." At this moment, Whimsy heard the sound of footsteps in the corridor above the kitchen, heavy and authoritative in their bearing, accompanied by the murmur of Sir Humphrey's voice, attempting to explain something with considerably less eloquence than one might hope. Inspector Fulton, Whimsy deduced, had apparently arrived to investigate matters that he believed had already been adequately resolved. Whimsy exchanged a glance with Mrs. Pettigrew that suggested a compact of silence, or at the very least, a mutual understanding that the information she had provided was not necessarily intended for official consumption. "One final question," he said softly. "When Miss Catherine departed on Monday evening, did she take anything with her? A package, a letter, something her father might have given her?" Mrs. Pettigrew's eyes flickered toward a small cupboard set beneath the sink, and that single gesture conveyed an enormous quantity of information regarding both her complicity and her determination to protect it. The footsteps grew closer, and Whimsy smiled. That peculiar smile that suggested he had just observed something of considerable significance, and found it rather more amusing than the circumstances strictly permitted. "How very helpful you have been, Mrs. Pettigrew," he said as the kitchen door opened and in. Inspector Fulton entered, regarding them both with an expression of profound suspicion. "I trust we shall have further occasion to discuss the domestic arrangements of this fascinating household." Inspector Fulton was precisely the sort of man Whimsy had anticipated, middle-aged, with the sort of face that suggested a lifetime of making rapid decisions based upon insufficient evidence, and then defending those decisions with the intransigence of someone who could not afford to admit error. His uniform was immaculate, his manner was brusque, and his expression upon observing Whimsy in the kitchen suggested that he had arrived expecting to discover some sort of crime scene, and instead found only a visitor engaged in what appeared to be an intimate conversation with a member of the domestic staff. "Lord Peter," he said, with the sort of tone that converted a title of respect into something approximating an accusation of impropriety, "I was not made aware that you were being brought into this matter." Sir Humphrey did not see fit to inform me that he was calling upon outside assistance. Wimsey rose from his seat with the languorous grace of a man entirely untroubled by accusations or implications of improper conduct, and extended his hand in cordial greeting. "Inspector Fulton, I presume. How delightful to make your acquaintance. I should clarify, however, that I have not been officially brought into this matter at all. I have merely accepted Sir Humphrey's invitation to visit his household, and having learned of this most unfortunate incident, I found myself unable to resist offering such small observations as my particular experience might afford. You will, I trust, understand that I harbor no desire whatsoever to interfere with your investigation. Though I confess I have found Mrs. Pettigrew's recollections regarding household matters to be rather remarkably detailed and illuminating." The inspector's jaw tightened, which Wimsey took as a sign that his explanation had achieved precisely the opposite of its ostensible purpose. "I have already established the facts of this matter, Inspector," Fulton announced, with the air of a man who had conducted a thorough investigation and was prepared to defend his conclusions with considerable vigor. "Edgar Marsh died of cardiac failure, brought on by his advanced age and what appears to have been a sedentary occupation. The doctor has confirmed this, and I see no reason to suspect foul play. The case is closed." Wimsey nodded thoughtfully, as though this pronouncement represented a triumph of investigative reasoning rather than a conclusion reached with unseemly haste. "How very efficient," he remarked, selecting an apple from a bowl on the kitchen table and examining it with the concentrated attention one might normally reserve for objects of considerable archaeological significance. "Though I confess I am curious regarding one or two minor points. The doctor who examined the body, Dr. Ashford, I believe, did he happen to note anything unusual about the corpse's appearance? Discoloration, perhaps, or peculiarities regarding rigor mortis?" Inspector Fulton's expression suggested that Wimsey had just inquired about the doctor's personal finances or the fidelity of his wife. "The examination was cursory but adequate," he said coldly. "There were no marks of violence, no signs of struggle. The man had simply reached the end of his natural term of existence, as men do." Wimsey took a deliberate bite of the apple, chewed thoughtfully, and then set it aside with an air of having found it substantially less palatable than anticipated. "Curious," he mused. "I had understood that Dr. Ashford was reputed to be a man of some competence, and yet I wonder whether he might have overlooked certain details that a comprehensive examination would have revealed. For instance, did he observe the position of the body with particular attention? The extended arm, reaching toward something that no longer appears to be present? The remarkable preservation of sartorial neatness despite the circumstances of the death?" Inspector Fulton's face had begun to acquire a shade of color that suggested he was contemplating the advisability of physically removing Wimsey from the kitchen, consequences notwithstanding. "What precisely are you implying, Lord Peter?" he demanded, each word enunciated with the precision of a man determined not to allow any ambiguity to intrude upon his righteous indignation. "Are you suggesting that I have been negligent in my investigation? That I have failed to perceive evidence of criminal activity where none exists?" Wimsey turned to face the inspector with an expression of sympathetic understanding that somehow managed to convey a profound skepticism regarding the intelligence being displayed before him. "I am suggesting nothing whatsoever, Inspector. I am merely observing that the human heart is indeed rather prone to failure, particularly in men of advanced years. However, the human heart does not generally reach toward empty space whilst simultaneously preserving an immaculate collar and a carefully arranged waistcoat. These are behaviors more commonly associated with men who have been positioned after death, rather than those who have simply succumbed to natural causes." The silence that followed this observation was sufficiently profound that one could almost hear the machinery of the inspector's mind grinding into motion, processing information he had apparently deemed irrelevant to the case at hand. "You are suggesting," he said slowly, "that the body has been moved?" Wimsey smiled, the sort of smile that suggested he had just observed a particularly pedestrian individual beginning to perceive a truth that should have been apparent from the outset. "I am suggesting nothing at all," he said. I am merely noting that the evidence presents certain inconsistencies with the theory of natural death. Whether those inconsistencies lead to any meaningful conclusions regarding the cause of Mr. Marsh's demise is, I confess, a matter that requires considerably more investigation than your initial assessment would appear to have permitted." Inspector Fulton opened his mouth as though to respond, then closed it again, his expression indicating that he had just realized the profound magnitude of the error he might have committed. Mrs. Pettigrew, standing silently by the sink, watched this exchange with an expression of profound resignation, as though she had understood from the very beginning that the truth regarding Edgar Marsh's death would eventually emerge, and that her small deceptions would prove insufficient to contain it. "I think," Wimsey continued, turning toward the door, "that it would be advisable for Dr. Ashford to conduct a more thorough examination of the corpse. One might begin with the contents of the stomach, which can reveal rather remarkable details regarding the timing and nature of a man's final meal. Dr. Ashford proved to be a man of considerably more intellectual flexibility than his initial examination had suggested, and upon being informed that his conclusions had been subjected to skeptical scrutiny by a man possessed of some little experience in matters of suspicious death, he agreed with remarkable alacrity to conduct a more comprehensive investigation. The body was conveyed to the small cottage that served as his surgery, and by early evening Wimsey found himself seated in that gentleman's study, perusing the results of an autopsy that had revealed considerably more information than the cursory external examination had permitted. "The stomach contents are decidedly anomalous," Dr. Ashford explained, adjusting his spectacles with the air of a man who had just discovered that his professional judgment had been rather more fallible than he had previously imagined. "There is evidence of a significant quantity of digitalis, foxglove extract to be precise. In concentrated form, it would produce symptoms consistent with acute cardiac failure, particularly in an elderly individual. The man had been poisoned, Lord Peter, deliberately, methodically, and with considerable sophistication regarding dosage and timing." Wimsey received this confirmation with the sort of expression one might adopt upon being told something one had already deduced with near certainty. "How very interesting," he remarked, rising to examine the laboratory notes with the concentration of a scholar examining a manuscript of considerable linguistic complexity. "And the poison was administered through what medium, do you imagine?" "Food, certainly, given the evidence in the stomach, but the manner of administration requires somewhat more precise determination. A dessert, perhaps? Something sweet enough to mask the bitter taste of foxglove, yet not so elaborate as to raise suspicion." Dr. Ashford consulted his notes with the air of a man still coming to terms with his own incompetence. "Judging by the partially digested matter, I would estimate that the poison was introduced through a custard or similar preparation. There are traces of egg and cream, mixed with what appears to have been an arsenic-based compound as well, which suggests either a double poisoning or the use of arsenic as a masking agent for the taste of the digitalis. Either way, whoever prepared this substance possessed considerable knowledge of toxicology." Wimsey nodded slowly, his mind clearly engaged in some process of internal calculation that had little to do with the medical evidence before him, and considerably more to do with the domestic arrangements of Thornfield Manor. And when precisely would this poison have been administered? Based upon the degree of digestion, I mean. Dr. Ashford consulted his notes once more. Approximately 2 to 3 hours before death. Given that the body was discovered at 8:30 in the morning, and that he was quite thoroughly deceased by that time, rigor mortis had already begun to set in. I would estimate that Mr. Marsh consumed the poisoned preparation sometime between 4 and 5 o'clock on Monday afternoon. Or possibly earlier, if the digestion was slower than usual, which would not be remarkable in a man of his age. Wimsey's expression shifted into that peculiar mode of concentration that suggested he was engaged in the process of reassembling a complicated chronology, and that each new piece of temporal information was causing him to revise his understanding of events with greater or lesser degrees of satisfaction. "Then we have a rather curious situation," he said, turning away from the autopsy notes and moving toward the window, where the evening was drawing to a close with that particular quality of melancholy that seems to pervade English autumn landscapes. A man consumes poisoned custard at approximately 4 or 5 o'clock on Monday afternoon. His daughter visits him at 8 o'clock in the evening, or thereabouts, according to Mrs. Pettigrew's recollection, and remains with him for perhaps 20 minutes. He is discovered dead at 8:30 on Tuesday morning, having suffered apparent cardiac failure during the intervening hours. Now, the critical question becomes whether Miss Catherine Marsh administered the poison before her visit, during her visit, or whether she was simply unfortunate enough to arrive at a point in time when her father was already dying. Dr. Ashford looked distinctly uncomfortable with this line of reasoning, as though he had only now begun to perceive the full complexity of the situation into which he had waded. But surely, the doctor ventured, if the poison was administered at 4 or 5 o'clock, and the daughter did not arrive until 8 o'clock, then she could not have been responsible for the poisoning itself. The effects would have already begun to manifest. Wimsey turned to face him with an expression that suggested sympathy mixed with a certain mild amusement at the doctor's reasoning. "You assume, of course, that the poison was administered at 4 or 5 o'clock precisely because that is when the body's digestive processes suggest it entered the stomach. However, it is entirely possible that the poison was administered at an earlier time, and that the partial digestion we observe is the result of considerably slower gastric activity than one might normally anticipate. A man in a state of acute anxiety, for instance, might experience marked delays in digestion. Moreover, it is possible that the poison was administered in multiple stages, a small quantity at one time, a larger quantity at another, with the cumulative effect producing the observed result." He paused, allowing the implications of this reasoning to settle upon Dr. Ashford like autumn leaves accumulating upon a garden path. "I suspect, however, that the more plausible explanation involves a considerably different timeline than either of us has yet considered. I propose that we return to Thornfield Manor and conduct a more thorough examination of Mr. Marsh's pantry, paying particular attention to any culinary preparations that might have been left for his consumption." The drive back to the manor was conducted in thoughtful silence, with Wimsey maintaining an air of internal preoccupation that sug. Ested, he was engaged in some process of mental chess, moving pieces around a board that only he could perceive. When they arrived, the house had taken on that peculiar quality of nocturnal watchfulness that old houses seem to acquire when they contain secrets, and Wimsey made directly for the pantry, where he proceeded to examine every cupboard, every shelf, and every drawer with the meticulous attention to detail that had become his hallmark. It was in a small icebox, tucked beneath a cloth and labelled in careful handwriting, that he discovered what he was searching for, a small custard bowl, half empty, with a faint residue at the bottom that suggested it had contained something considerably more elaborate than mere dessert. The discovery of the custard bowl occasioned a flurry of activity that might have appeared chaotic to a casual observer, but which struck Wimsey as the inevitable consequence of evidence emerging in a manner that could no longer be ignored or dismissed. Inspector Fulton was summoned, arrived with an expression of profound consternation, and immediately set about the business of securing the bowl as evidence and initiating what he was pleased to term a proper investigation. Dr. Ashford returned to his laboratory with the residue for analysis, and Sir Humphrey appeared in the pantry with a face so thoroughly drained of colour that one might have suspected him of suffering from a sympathetic cardiac event. It was during this organised tumult that Wimsey slipped quietly away from the pantry and made his way to the servants' quarters, where he had ascertained that Mrs. Pettigrew maintained her small room adjacent to the kitchen. The cook answered his knock with the expression of a woman who had been expecting this particular visit for some considerable time, as though she had resigned herself to the inevitability of further interrogation the moment. She had revealed the existence of the custard bowl. "You knew about the poison," Wimsey said, settling himself into the small chair she offered, with the air of a man preparing for a conversation of some considerable duration and intimacy. "Or at the very least, you suspected it. The question that remains is whether you knew before Mr. Marsh's death or only afterward, when you attempted to dispose of the evidence by placing it in the icebox, where it would be discovered eventually but not immediately." Mrs. Pettigrew wrung her hands with the concentration of a woman attempting to compress her entire moral anguish into a physical gesture. "I didn't know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not at first, but when I found him Monday evening, when I went to tell him that supper was ready, I saw the bowl. I knew that something was wrong. Mr. Marsh had been troubled all day, you see, and then Miss Catherine came, and they talked in the pantry, and when she left I went to see if he needed anything, and he was sitting in his chair looking as though all the life had drained out of him." She paused, collecting herself with visible effort. The bowl was there on the table, and it was nearly empty, and I could smell something wrong about it. Something bitter, underneath the custard and cream. So I took it and hid it, thinking that perhaps Miss Catherine had. Her voice trailed away into an assumption that hung in the air between them like an accusation. "You believed that Miss Catherine had poisoned her father," Whimsy said, not as a question but as a statement of fact that required neither confirmation nor denial. "And you chose to protect her by concealing the evidence, thereby effectively obstructing a police investigation and making yourself complicit in what might have constituted murder. A curious decision, Mrs. Pettigrew, particularly for a woman of your evident moral sensibilities, which suggests that you do not, in fact, believe Miss Catherine responsible for this crime, despite all appearances to the contrary. What precisely has caused you to revise this initial assumption?" Mrs. Pettigrew's face took on an expression of profound distress, as though she had just been asked to articulate a truth that she had been attempting to suppress through the simple expedient of refusing to examine it too closely. "Because," she said finally, "Miss Catherine was devastated when she left. She was crying, sir, truly crying, as though her heart was breaking. And when I found Mr. Marsh with that bowl, I understood that she would be blamed, that all the evidence would point to her, and yet she was innocent. She had come to reconcile with her father, and he had allowed her to believe that they might finally have a life together, and then—" She stopped, unable or unwilling to continue. Whimsy rose and moved to the small window that looked out upon the garden, now shrouded in darkness save for the faint light that emerged from the kitchen. "Tell me," he said quietly, "did Mr. Marsh have any particular affection for custard? Was it a dessert he commonly consumed?" Mrs. Pettigrew hesitated, then nodded slowly. "It was his favorite, particularly a certain recipe that required eggs and cream from the Manor dairy. I prepared it for him frequently, at least twice a week. He was quite particular about it, insisted that it be made only with fresh eggs and the finest cream." Whimsy turned to face her, and his expression suggested that this apparently innocent detail had confirmed some suspicion that had been forming in his mind. And who, precisely, had access to the ingredients necessary to prepare this custard? Who, in other words, might have been in a position to introduce the poison without raising undue suspicion regarding the source? Mrs. Pettigrew's face went white as comprehension dawned. "Oh God," she whispered. "Oh God, no. You cannot possibly think—" But Whimsy was already moving toward the door, his expression transformed from one of thoughtful investigation to something considerably more urgent. He found Sir Humphrey in the drawing-room, seated before the fire with a glass of brandy in one hand and an expression that suggested a man contemplating matters of considerable philosophical weight. "Tell me, Sir Humphrey," Whimsy said without preamble, "how many times did you instruct the kitchen staff to prepare Mr. Marsh's custard in the days preceding his death? And more importantly, did you perhaps take it upon yourself to deliver one of these preparations to his pantry personally, thereby ensuring that it was prepared to his particular satisfaction?" Sir Humphrey's hand trembled slightly, causing the brandy to slosh against the sides of his glass. "I don't know what you're implying," he said, but his voice had lost all the performative confidence it had previously maintained. "But if you are suggesting that I had anything to do with Edgar's death, you are gravely mistaken. The man was a faithful servant to this household for 15 years. Whimsy moved toward the fireplace with the slow deliberation of a man approaching an animal he suspected of being dangerous, but wished to avoid alarming unnecessarily. "A faithful servant," he repeated thoughtfully. "Though I wonder whether the faithfulness was entirely on one side of the equation. Tell me, what precisely was the nature of your relationship with Miss Catherine Marsh?" Sir Humphrey's reaction to this question was sufficiently pronounced that Wimsey found himself almost sympathetic to the man's predicament, though sympathy and the absence of judgment are not necessarily synonymous. The baronet's hand dropped to his lap, the brandy sloshing onto his trouser leg in a manner that suggested he had ceased to concern himself with matters of sartorial propriety. "How did you—" he began, then stopped, gathering himself with visible effort. "There is nothing improper about my acquaintance with Miss Catherine. She is a talented actress, a woman of considerable refinement and intelligence, and we have developed a friendship of some meaningful substance." Wimsey settled himself into a chair opposite the fireplace, with the air of a man preparing to listen to a confession that had been building toward utterance for some considerable time. "A friendship, you say? How very delicately phrased. And when did this friendship commence? Prior to Mr. Marsh's arrival at Thornfield, I presume, or did it develop subsequently to his employment in your household?" Sir Humphrey's jaw tightened, and Wimsey observed with interest the manner in which the baronet's fingers clenched and unclenched around the stem of his brandy glass. "We met approximately 3 years ago in London," he said finally, each word delivered with the precision of someone attempting to navigate a minefield of his own construction, "at a theatrical exhibition. She was performing in a small production, and I was in attendance. We struck up a conversation, and over time our acquaintance developed into something considerably more substantial." "Something considerably more substantial," Wimsey repeated, allowing the phrase to hang in the air with all the weight of its implications. "Might one characterize this development as romantic in nature? Or would you prefer to maintain the pretense that this was merely an intellectual friendship conducted through theatrical discourse and the occasional dinner in London establishments, where one might reasonably expect to avoid encountering one's social acquaintances?" Sir Humphrey set his brandy glass down upon the side table with a gesture that suggested the action required considerable effort. "She came to depend upon me," he said, and there was something in his voice that suggested a confession rather than a defense. "Her career was not flourishing as she had hoped. She required financial assistance. I was in a position to provide it. There was nothing sordid about the arrangement. I cared for her genuinely, and she appreciated my assistance." Wimsey rose and moved toward the window, where the darkness beyond the glass seemed to press against the panes with an almost physical force. "And yet," he said quietly, "Miss Catherine chose to visit her father on Monday evening, rather than maintaining this convenient arrangement with you, which suggests that something had transpired to alter the equilibrium of your relationship. The arrival of her father in the household, perhaps? Or more specifically, the opportunity that his presence might afford for a reconciliation that would render her dependent upon your financial assistance considerably less necessary." The silence that followed this observation was sufficiently profound that Wimsey could hear the ticking of the mantelpiece clock and the faint crackling of the fire. Sir Humphrey's face had taken on a shade of colour that suggested acute internal distress, and when he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "She asked me for money," he said, "a substantial sum. She wanted to establish herself independently, to move away from the theatrical world and begin a new life. She said she had discovered that her father was alive and living in my household, and that she intended to contact him and attempt reconciliation. She believed that he would assist her financially, that they might begin anew as a family." Wimsey turned from the window to face the baronet directly. "And you did not wish this reconciliation to occur. You were afraid that her father might provide for her in a manner that would render her dependent upon you entirely unnecessary. You were afraid of losing her." Sir Humphrey's face crumpled slightly, and Wimsey observed that beneath the aristocratic bearing and the performative confidence, there existed a man capable of considerable emotional vulnerability, and, perhaps, considerable desperation. "I offered her the money," Sir Humphrey said, his voice now heavy with the weight of confession. "I would have given her anything she asked. But she was determined to see her father first, to attempt to reconcile before making any decisions regarding her future. She said that she needed to understand his character, to determine whether he was a man worth knowing before she allowed him to influence her life." He paused, and his expression took on a quality of genuine anguish. I knew I understood that if Edgar took her in, if they developed a relationship, she would not need me anymore. She would escape, and I would be left with nothing but memories of what we had shared and the knowledge that I had failed to convince her to value my devotion above familial sentiment. Whimsy's expression remained impassive, though his eyes narrowed slightly as he processed this revelation. And so you decided to ensure that her father would not be in a position to develop any relationship whatsoever with his daughter. You poisoned his custard, knowing that he consumed it regularly, and you did so in a manner calculated to produce the appearance of natural death. A cardiac event, the doctor would conclude, an elderly man's heart simply ceasing its labors. And Miss Catherine, having reconciled with her father or begun the process of reconciliation, would find herself alone once again, with no one to turn to but you, her sole remaining support, her only comfort in the face of loss. Sir Humphrey rose abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the drawing-room. "I did not murder him," he said, and his voice had taken on a note of desperation that suggested he believed himself to be speaking truth, even if that truth was substantially more complicated than a simple denial. "I prepared the custard with the intention of making him ill, to delay the reconciliation, to provide myself with time to convince Catherine that her future lay with me. The poison was meant to sicken him, not to kill him. I miscalculated the dosage. I never intended—" He stopped, and the realization that intention and consequence are not necessarily aligned seemed to strike him with considerable force. Whimsy moved toward the door with the air of a man who has heard sufficient confession for the evening. "I suggest, Sir Humphrey, that you prepare yourself for a conversation with Inspector Fulton. He will, I suspect, be considerably less inclined to sympathy than I have demonstrated, and considerably more focused upon the rather straightforward matter of your culpability in this affair." The confrontation between Sir Humphrey and Inspector Fulton, when it finally occurred in the St. Udi, some 20 minutes later, proved to be rather less dramatic than one might have anticipated, given the circumstances. The baronet offered no resistance, no theatrical denial, no attempt at escape or obfuscation. Instead, he simply sat in the chair Whimsy had vacated and provided a detailed account of his actions that was so thorough in its self-incrimination that the inspector found himself occasionally pausing to ensure that the man was not, in fact, suffering from some form of delusional episode that had caused him to confess to crimes he had not committed. Yet the facts themselves were incontrovertible. Sir Humphrey had indeed prepared the poisoned custard on Monday afternoon, had ensured its placement in Mr. Marsh's pantry under the pretense of ensuring that the preparation was to the steward's exact specifications, and had done so with the deliberate intention of introducing sufficient toxins to produce severe illness without, as he maintained with increasing desperation, necessarily resulting in death. The double compound of digitalis and arsenic, however, had proved rather more lethal in combination than Sir Humphrey's cursory research into the matter had suggested it might be. What emerged during the subsequent examination of Sir Humphrey's chambers was a letter, written but unsent, to Miss Catherine Marsh, in which the baronet had outlined with considerable eloquence his plan to ensure that her father would be temporarily incapacitated, thereby necessitating her presence at Thornfield Manor for an extended period during which Sir Humphrey might convince her of the superiority of his affection to any familial sentiment. The letter was written in language that alternated between passionate declaration and clinical description of the poisoning process, suggesting a mind substantially more fractured than his outwardly composed demeanor had indicated. Whimsy X. A mind the document with the expression of a man reading a text that confirmed certain deductions he had already formulated, though the specific details were perhaps rather more elaborate than he had anticipated. "Fascinating," he remarked to Inspector Fulton, who was regarding the letter with the expression of a man encountering evidence that required no interpretation whatsoever. The man actually believed that poisoning the woman's father would constitute a romantic gesture. One would almost admire the audacity of such reasoning if one did not simultaneously recognize it as the product of a profoundly disordered intellect. By the following morning, the machinery of English justice had begun its inexorable motion, and Sir Humphrey Blackwood was removed from Thornfield Manor by local constables to await trial on charges of murder. Inspector Fulton, somewhat belatedly, began to demonstrate the competence that ought to have been evident from the outset, conducting interviews with the household staff and attempting to reconstruct with greater precision the exact sequence of events that had culminated in Edgar Marsh's death. It was during one of these interviews that a detail emerged which Wimsey found substantially more significant than the inspector appeared to recognize. The cook, when questioned regarding the preparation of the custard bowl, revealed that she had not actually prepared the dish on Monday afternoon. Instead, she had prepared it on Sunday evening, intending it for the steward's consumption on Monday. However, Sir Humphrey had instructed her to prepare a fresh batch on Monday afternoon, claiming that the original had been accidentally spoiled and must be discarded. It was this second batch, prepared under Sir Humphrey's ostensible supervision, that had contained the poison. The implications of this detail led Wimsey to request a private conversation with Miss Catherine Marsh, who had been located in London and brought to Thornfield Manor to provide testimony regarding her visit with her father. She was a woman of perhaps 35 years of age, with features that bore a certain resemblance to the steward's own, though refined by theatrical training and London society into something considerably more elegant. She bore herself with a composure that seemed to mask considerable emotional turbulence, and when Wimsey entered the small parlour where she had been established, she regarded him with eyes that suggested she had been expecting him, or at least someone like him, to eventually seek her out for further interrogation. "You wish to know what occurred during my visit with my father," she said, dispensing with conventional greetings and proceeding directly to what she perceived as the inevitable subject of their conversation. Wimsey settled himself into a chair with the air of a man preparing to listen rather than to question. "I wish to know," he said, "what precisely your father said to you during the 20 minutes or so that you spent together. Not the broad emotional tenor of the conversation, you understand, but the specific content, the details that mattered to him, the revelations he felt compelled to make." Miss Catherine's composure flickered slightly, and Wimsey observed with interest the manner in which her hands clenched in her lap. "He told me that he had always loved me," she said quietly, "that he had been forced to give me up, that my mother had demanded it, and that he had spent every year since regretting that decision. He told me that he had built a life here at the manor, a respectable life, but that it was empty because it lacked, because I was not part of it." She paused, collecting herself with visible effort, and then he told me something else, something that changed everything. Wimsey leaned forward slightly, his expression indicating that this revelation was precisely the information he had been anticipating. "What did he tell you, Miss Marsh?" Miss Catherine looked away toward the window, where the English countryside was displaying itself in all its autumn melancholy. "He told me that Sir Humphrey had come to the pantry on Monday afternoon, and that Sir Humphrey had prepared the custard himself, replacing the original preparation with one he had personally created. My father realized immediately what this meant, that Sir Humphrey was attempting to poison him. He understood that Sir Humphrey had done this because of me, because of what he felt for me, and because he was afraid that my father would intervene to protect me from his influence." She turned back to face Wimsey, and her eyes were red with unshed tears. "My father ate the poisoned custard deliberately, Lord Peter. He ate it knowing it would kill him, understanding that it was the only way he could protect me from a man he recognized as dangerous and deranged. The revelation that Edgar Marsh had essentially committed suicide in order to protect his daughter from Sir Humphrey's obsessive influence occasioned a rather significant revision of Wimsey's understanding of the case, though his external demeanor suggested nothing more than a mild interest in this particular detail. He sat in silence for some considerable time, his fingers steepled beneath his chin in that characteristic pose that indicated his mind was engaged in some process of internal recalibration. "Your father," he said finally, "recognized the poison immediately upon tasting it. This suggests that he possessed some knowledge of toxicology, or at the very least, that he had some familiarity with the taste of poisoned substances. A rather unusual accomplishment for a house steward, would you not agree?" Miss Catherine nodded slow, why, as though she had been anticipating this particular line of inquiry. "My father was not always a steward," she said. Before he met my mother, before circumstances forced him into obscurity, he was a chemist. He possessed considerable knowledge regarding the composition of various compounds and their effects. When Sir Humphrey presented him with the custard, he tasted the bitterness of the poison immediately, and he understood what was occurring. Wimsey's expression suggested that this explanation clarified considerably more than the simple matter of how the steward had recognized his impending doom, and he made the conscious decision to consume it regardless, he continued, understanding that by doing so, he would remove himself as an obstacle to Sir Humphrey's continued pursuit of his daughter, while simultaneously ensuring that his death would be perceived as natural, thereby preventing any investigation that might reveal the true nature of Sir Humphrey's obsession and the danger he posed to Miss Marsh's future well-being. A sacrifice, one might say, though whether such a sacrifice is ultimately noble or merely tragic is perhaps a question that admits of no definitive answer. He rose from his seat and moved toward the window, where the autumn light was beginning to acquire that particular quality of melancholy that seems endemic to English afternoons. The question now becomes whether this information substantially alters the legal and moral dimensions of Sir Humphrey's culpability. He attempted murder with poisoned custard. That the poison was consumed voluntarily by the victim does not render the attempt any less culpable in the eyes of the law. The fact that the intended consequence was indeed achieved, albeit through a mechanism that the perpetrator did not anticipate, seems to render the distinction between attempted and successful murder somewhat arcade. "Mike," Miss Catherine's voice, when she spoke again, was barely audible. "Will Sir Humphrey be hanged?" she asked, and the question contained within it all the moral complexity that had accumulated throughout the course of this investigation. Wimsey turned to face her, and his expression was sufficiently grave that Miss Catherine understood immediately that the law would not be content with merely nominal punishment. The law, he said, is not generally inclined toward leniency in cases of murder, regardless of whether the murder was committed through active agency or through the manipulation of circumstances that led the victim to engineer his own demise. Sir Humphrey poisoned your father with the deliberate intention of killing him, or at the very least with the knowledge that death was a probable consequence of his actions. The fact that your father chose to consume the poison does not absolve Sir Humphrey of responsibility for having created the conditions that made such a choice possible. In the eyes of the law, he is guilty of murder. Whether the jury will ultimately so find is, of course, a matter that remains to be determined at trial. Wimsey moved toward the door, then paused, turning back to face Miss Marsh with an expression that suggested he had one final question that required answering. "Did your father," he asked, "make any attempt to prevent you from knowing the truth of what had occurred? Did he attempt to protect you from the knowledge that his death was not accidental, that he had made a conscious choice to sacrifice himself for your protection?" Miss Catherine shook her head slowly. "He told me everything," she said. During those final 20 minutes together, he explained what he had recognized, what he understood Sir Humphrey's intentions to be, and what he had resolved to do. He told me that he had spent 20 years regretting his failure to protect me from the circumstances of my birth, and that he would not fail me a second time. He wanted me to understand that his death was not an accident of fate, but a deliberate choice made in love. Her voice broke slightly as she continued. He made me promise that I would tell the truth, regardless of the consequences for Sir Humphrey. He said that a lie in his service would be a betrayal of everything he had attempted to accomplish. Wimsey's expression suggested a profound appreciation for the moral complexity that this revelation had introduced into what had initially appeared to be a relatively straightforward case of poisoning. "Your father was a remarkable man," he said quietly. "In his final act, he accomplished something far more significant than merely removing himself as an obstacle. He ensured that the truth would emerge, that the danger Sir Humphrey posed would be fully comprehended, and that justice would be pursued not through accident or circumstance, but through the deliberate and courageous action of bearing witness. That takes considerable strength of character." He moved toward the door, then paused once more. "I suspect that Inspector Fulton will wish to conduct a formal statement from you regarding these events. I would advise you to provide a complete and accurate account. The law is often clumsy in its administration of justice, but it is not on the whole, inclined to punish truth-telling, even when that truth complicates the apparent guilt of the accused. As Wimsey departed from the parlor, he found himself contemplating the curious circumstances that had transformed what had initially appeared to be a straightforward case of homicidal poisoning into something considerably more complex, a tragedy in which the victim had become, in effect, an accomplice in his own death, pursuing justice not through external agency but through the ultimate sacrifice of his own life. The case would proceed to trial, Sir Humphrey would be convicted, and he would almost certainly hang for his crime. Yet Wimsey found himself wondering whether justice, when achieved through such circuitous and costly means, could ever truly be said to have prevailed. The trial of Sir Humphrey Blackwood commenced on a grey November morning at the Assizes, conducted before a judge whose expression suggested that he had witnessed considerably more depravity in the name of romantic obsession than the law books had prepared him to confront. The prosecution's case was straightforward and damning. A man motivated by jealous desire had deliberately poisoned another man, and the fact that the victim had subsequently chosen to consume the poison did not alter the fundamental criminality of the act. The defense attempted to construct an argument centered upon Sir Humphrey's allegedly diminished mental capacity, suggesting that a man so consumed by passion as to be driven to such measures could not be held entirely responsible for his actions. It was precisely the sort of argument that juries find simultaneously compelling and reprehensible, and the proceedings stretched across 3 days with the accumulated weight of testimony that seemed to grow heavier rather than lighter as the trial progressed. Wimsey attended the proceedings with the air of a man fulfilling an obligation rather than pursuing a professional interest, and he sat in the public gallery with an expression of detached amusement that suggested the proceedings below were somewhat less intellectually demanding than the morning's crossword puzzle. On the final day of testimony, Sir Humphrey himself took the stand in what his counsel clearly hoped would be a dramatic appeal to the jury's sympathy. He spoke of his genuine affection for Miss Catherine Marsh, of his conviction that her father R. represented a threat to her well-being, of his belief that a period of illness would allow him to demonstrate the constancy of his devotion and thereby convince her of the superiority of his protection over any familial sentiment. His voice was carefully modulated, his manner appropriately contrite, and his overall presentation suggested a man who had made a terrible error of judgment rather than one who had deliberately attempted to commit murder. Yet as he spoke, Wimsey observed something that appeared to have escaped the notice of everyone else present. A certain quality of performance, a theatrical precision in his emotional display that suggested Sir Humphrey was not in fact entirely sincere in his expressions of regret. The man was acting, Wimsey realized, performing the role of a penitent criminal with considerably more skill than one would typically expect from an amateur. This observation struck him as considerably more significant than it might initially appear, though he maintained his expression of detached amusement and made no move to communicate this perception to anyone present. When the jury returned after deliberating for less than 3 hours, their verdict was precisely what one would have anticipated: guilty of murder. Sir Humphrey received the pronouncement with an expression that suggested mild surprise rather than genuine devastation, and as the judge proceeded to don the black cap preparatory to pronouncing sentence, Wimsey found himself seized by a sudden conviction that something was substantially amiss with the entire proceedings. The judge intoned the sentence of death with appropriate gravity, and Sir Humphrey was led away to the holding cells below the courthouse, his bearing suggesting that he was contemplating matters of considerably less immediate concern than his imminent execution. It was only after the courtroom had begun to empty tea Hat Wimsey rose from his seat and made his way down to request an interview with the condemned man, a request that was granted with the sort of casual indifference that characterizes the treatment of the condemned in institutions devoted to the administration of justice. Sir Humphrey received him in a small room adjacent to the cells, and his expression upon seeing Wimsey was sufficiently revealing that the detective found his suspicions substantially confirmed. "You know," Sir Humphrey said, without preamble or conventional greeting, "you know that something is not quite as it appears." Whimsy settled himself into a chair with the air of a man preparing for a conversation of considerable significance. "I know," he replied, "that you are a considerably more complicated man than either the prosecution or the defense have permitted the jury to comprehend. I know that you are capable of considerable theatrical performance, and that your expression of regret during your testimony was substantially more theatrical than genuinely felt. I know that a man motivated primarily by obsessive passion does not generally demonstrate such remarkable composure in the face of a death sentence. And I know that there is something regarding this entire affair that you have not yet revealed, something that you believe the world should understand before you meet whatever fate awaits you beyond the reach of English justice." Sir Humphrey smiled, a peculiar smile that contained within it something approaching genuine amusement rather than despair. "I did not murder Edgar Marsh," he said quietly. "Not, that is, in the manner that the court has determined. I did indeed prepare the poisoned custard with the intention of making him ill, perhaps even gravely ill. But I did not intend for it to be fatal, and I did not expect him to consume it knowing it contained poison. That was his choice, his sack. Riffis, his way of protecting his daughter from what he perceived as my dangerous obsession." He paused, allowing this revelation to settle between them. "But Miss Catherine did not tell you the complete truth regarding our relationship, and neither, I suspect, did her father. The truth is considerably more complex, considerably more tragic than either of them has permitted you to understand." Whimsy leaned forward slightly, his expression indicating that this confession was precisely the sort of revelation he had been anticipating. "Tell me," he said simply. Sir Humphrey drew a long breath, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost all trace of theatrical performance. "Miss Catherine came to me 3 months ago asking for money to leave England entirely, to establish herself abroad under an assumed name, to disappear from society entirely. When I asked her why, she informed me that she was pregnant, and that the father of her child was a man of considerable social standing who had no intention of acknowledging his paternity or providing for the child's support. She was desperate, terrified, and entirely dependent upon finding resources that would allow her to establish herself in exile with some measure of financial security.